Welcome to this peaceful journey through the most profound dreams and visions recorded in ancient scripture. As you settle into comfort for the night, let these timeless stories of divine encounters wash over you like gentle waves. These are tales of ordinary people who experienced extraordinary moments when heaven touched earth through the mysterious realm of sleep and vision. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to drift into these sacred narratives that have comforted and inspired countless souls across the centuries. In the beginning, when the world was young and creation itself was still warm with the breath of the divine, there lived the first man in a garden of unspeakable beauty. Adam walked among trees whose leaves whispered ancient songs, beside waters that reflected not just his image, but something deeper, a longing that even paradise could not fully satisfy. The Creator, who had formed him from the dust with tender hands, observed this restlessness in his beloved creation. The evening light was soft and golden when the Lord God decided to fulfill the deepest need of Adam's heart. But this gift would not come through waking consciousness. It would emerge from the mysterious depths of divine sleep. As Adam lay beneath a canopy of stars that seemed to pulse with living light, a profound drowsiness settled upon him. This was no ordinary sleep, but a sacred unconsciousness, deeper than any slumber he had ever known. In this supernatural rest, Adam's spirit soared beyond the boundaries of his physical form. He experienced visions of harmony and completion, of two hearts beating as one, of companionship that would echo through eternity. In his dream, he saw himself not as solitary, but as part of something infinitely more beautiful, a union that reflected the very nature of love itself. The images flowed through his sleeping mind like poetry written in starlight. When Adam awakened, he found beside him one whose beauty surpassed even his dreams. Eve, formed from his own essence while he slept, stood before him like a living prayer answered. "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," he whispered, understanding somehow that what he had dreamed had become reality. The divine sleep had bridged the gap between longing and fulfillment, between solitude and perfect companionship. This first dream had been a gift, a glimpse into the heart of divine love itself. Time flowed like a gentle river, and generations passed like seasons in an eternal garden. The descendants of Adam scattered across the earth, carrying within them the memory of that first divine dream. Among them walked a man named Jacob, whose own encounter with the realm of sleep would reshape the destiny of nations. But Jacob's path to that sacred vision was neither straight nor easy. He had deceived his father and stolen his brother's blessing, and now he fled across the wilderness like a man pursued by his own conscience. The sun was setting as he reached a desolate place called Luz, where ancient stones lay scattered like forgotten prayers. Exhaustion weighed upon him like a heavy cloak, and using one of the stones as a pillow, he lay down beneath the darkening sky. As Jacob's eyes closed and his breathing deepened, the boundary between earth and heaven began to dissolve. In his dream, he saw something that would forever change his understanding of the divine presence. A great ladder appeared, its base firmly planted on the earth where he lay, but its top reaching beyond the clouds into the very throne room of God. The ladder seemed to be made of light itself, each rung gleaming like crystallized starlight. Upon this celestial stairway, angels moved in endless procession. Some descended from heaven to earth, their faces radiant with divine purpose, carrying messages and blessings to sleeping mortals below. Others climbed upward, bearing the prayers and tears of humanity back to the heart of God. The sight was so beautiful that Jacob's dreaming heart could barely contain it. The angels moved with fluid grace, their wings creating harmonies that resonated through his soul like the memory of home. At the top of the ladder, Jacob saw the Lord himself, clothed in glory that made the sun seem dim by comparison. The divine voice spoke with such tenderness that it seemed to heal something broken in Jacob's spirit. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your descendants shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. In you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. The promise wrapped around Jacob's dreaming consciousness like a warm embrace. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. The words echoed through the corridors of his sleeping mind, each syllable a covenant written in light. When Jacob awakened in the pale light of dawn, the dream clung to him like dew on morning grass. The ordinary stones around him seemed somehow transformed, sanctified by the divine presence that had touched this place through his vision. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it, he whispered, his voice trembling with awe. He took the stone that had served as his pillow and set it up as a memorial, pouring oil upon it and calling the place Bethel, the house of God. The memory of that dream would sustain Jacob through years of struggle and transformation. He would become Israel, the father of 12 sons whose descendants would become a great nation. But it all began with a dream in a lonely place, where heaven's ladder had bridged the gap between human desperation and divine promise. Among Jacob's 12 sons, one stood apart, not for his strength or wisdom, but for the dreams that visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. Joseph was 17 when the visions began, a young shepherd with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding beyond his years. The dreams came to him like gentle visitors, bearing messages that would shape the destiny of nations yet unborn. The first dream arrived on a night when the autumn air carried the scent of harvest. In his sleep, Joseph found himself in a field of grain, working alongside his brothers under the golden sun. As they laboured together, their sheaves of wheat stood upright in neat rows across the fertile ground. But as Joseph watched in wonder, his own sheaf slowly rose higher than the others, standing tall and proud, while his brothers' sheaves bowed down in reverence around it. The image was so vivid, so filled with symbolic meaning, that Joseph carried it with him when he awakened. The dream felt like a prophecy written in the language of growing things, speaking of authority and leadership that seemed impossible for the second youngest son of Jacob. Yet the vision had been so clear, so undeniably divine in its origin, that Joseph felt compelled to share it with his family. His brothers' faces darkened when he recounted the dream. They saw in it not divine revelation, but youthful arrogance, and their hearts grew cold toward their dreaming brother. But Joseph was not deterred, for soon another vision came to him, even more magnificent than the first. This second dream painted itself across the canvas of night sky. Joseph stood in a vast wilderness under a dome of stars that seemed close enough to touch. As he watched in breathless amazement, 11 stars moved across the heavens in stately procession, accompanied by the sun and moon themselves. All these celestial bodies moved toward him and bowed down, their light creating a crown of glory around his head. The dream was so beautiful, so overwhelming in its implications, that Joseph's heart raced even as he slept. He saw himself not as the young shepherd he was, but as someone chosen for greatness beyond imagining. The stars seemed to whisper secrets of the future, of famine and plenty, of salvation that would come through suffering, of a destiny written in the very fabric of creation itself. When morning came and Joseph shared this second dream with his family, even his father Jacob was troubled. "What is this dream that you have dreamed?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and concern. "Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?" Yet Jacob kept the saying in his heart, sensing that these dreams carried weight beyond their immediate understanding. The jealousy of Joseph's brothers burned like coals in their hearts. They could not bear the thought that their younger brother might be destined for greatness while they remained in shadow. Their resentment grew day by day until it consumed them like fire, leading them down a dark path that would paradoxically fulfill the very dreams they sought to prevent. When the opportunity came to rid themselves of their dreaming brother, they seized it with desperate fury. They sold Joseph into slavery, telling their father that wild beasts had devoured the boy. As the caravan carried Joseph away toward Egypt, his dreams must have seemed like cruel mockeries. Yet in the mysterious ways of providence, this betrayal would become the very instrument through which his visions would find their fulfillment. In the land of Egypt, Joseph's gift for interpreting dreams would elevate him from slave to ruler, from prisoner to savior of nations. But first, he would spend years in darkness, learning that the path from dream to reality often leads through valleys of shadow and testing. The dreams of his youth remained with him like stars in the darkness, reminding him that even in the deepest night, heaven's purposes continue to unfold. In the depths of Pharaoh's prison, where sunlight barely penetrated the thick stone walls, Joseph discovered that his gift for understanding dreams extended far beyond his own nocturnal visions. The prison was a place where men languished in despair, forgotten by the world above, sustained only by hope that flickered like candle flames in the darkness. Among these forgotten souls were two men whose dreams would become stepping stones on Joseph's path to destiny. The chief cupbearer and the chief baker had once served in Pharaoh's palace, moving through halls of splendor where golden vessels caught the light and the air was sweet with incense. Now they found themselves in cells of cold stone, their former lives seeming like distant dreams themselves. Both men had fallen from favor through some offense against their royal master, and both awaited an uncertain fate in the silence of the prison depths. It was in this place of shadows that dreams came to them on the same night, as if the realm of sleep had opened its treasures to two troubled souls simultaneously. The cupbearer's dream painted itself in images of abundance and restoration. He saw before him a grapevine with 3 branches that budded and blossomed and brought forth ripe grapes. In his dreaming hands appeared Pharaoh's cup, and he took the grapes and pressed them into the cup and placed it in Pharaoh's hand, just as he had done in the golden days of his service. The dream felt so real that the cupbearer awoke with the phantom taste of wine upon his lips and the memory of royal favour warming his heart. Yet confusion clouded his joy, for how could such a vision of restoration come to one imprisoned and forgotten? The images remained vivid throughout the following day, haunting him with their beauty and their mystery. The baker's dream came clothed in different symbols, carrying a message that would prove far more ominous. In his vision, he bore 3 baskets of bread upon his head, each filled with delicacies prepared for Pharaoh's table. The topmost basket contained all manner of baked goods that would have graced the royal banquet's pastries, golden as morning sunlight, bread that seemed to glow with inner warmth. But as he walked through his dream, birds of the air descended and devoured the food from the highest basket, leaving it empty and desolate. Both men arose troubled by their visions, carrying the weight of symbols they could not decipher. Their faces bore the marks of men who had glimpsed something significant in the realm of dreams, but lacked the key to unlock its meaning. It was then that Joseph, observing their distress, approached them with the compassion that had sustained him through his own trials. "Why do you look so sad today?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine concern. The 2 men looked at him with eyes that held both hope and desperation. "We have had dreams," they replied, "and there is no one to interpret them." Joseph's response revealed the source of his gift and the humility with which he wielded it. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" he said softly. "Please tell them to me." The cupbearer spoke first, recounting his dream of the vine and the grapes, the cup and the service restored. As he spoke, understanding dawned in Joseph's spirit like sunrise breaking over distant hills. The interpretation flowed through him like water from a spring, clear and undeniable. "The 3 branches are 3 days," Joseph explained, his voice gentle but certain. "In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer." Hope blazed in the cupbearer's eyes like a flame rekindled. Joseph's words carried the ring of truth, the resonance of divine revelation. But Joseph was not finished. With touching vulnerability, he added a personal request. "Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon." The baker, seeing the joy that had transformed his fellow prisoner's countenance, eagerly shared his own dream. But as Joseph listened to the account of baskets and birds, his face grew somber. The interpretation that came to him carried sorrow rather than celebration, and he delivered it with the tender gravity of one who understands that truth, however painful, must be spoken. "The 3 baskets are 3 days," Joseph said quietly. "In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." The words fell into the prison's silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of dread and acceptance. The baker's dream had spoken truly, but its message was one of judgment rather than restoration. 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, both interpretations came to pass exactly as Joseph had foretold. The cupbearer was restored to his position of honor, once again serving wine from golden vessels in the palace of kings. The baker met his fate upon a tree, just as the dream had foreshadowed. Joseph's gift had been vindicated, his interpretations proven true by the unfolding of events. Yet in the joy of his restoration, the cupbearer forgot the young Hebrew who had unlocked the mystery of his dream. Joseph remained in prison, seemingly abandoned once more, as 2 full years passed like seasons in a forgotten garden. But in the mysterious providence that governs the realm of dreams and their fulfillment, this apparent abandonment was merely the deepening of shadows before the dawn. For Pharaoh himself would soon require the services of one who could interpret the visions that would visit him in the depths of night, and when that time came, the cupbearer's memory would finally stir, leading to Joseph's ultimate vindication and elevation. In the palace chambers high above the Nile, where golden light danced through windows of precious stone, and the air was perfumed with frankincense and myrrh, Pharaoh the king of Egypt lay upon his royal bed, troubled by dreams that had shaken the very foundations of his peace. He was a man accustomed to power, surrounded by advisers who spoke only words he wished to hear, yet the visions that came to him in sleep carried an authority that even his earthly dominion could not dismiss or control. The first dream came to him as he slept to the gentle sound of the Nile flowing past his palace walls. In his vision, he stood beside the great river that was the lifeblood of his kingdom, watching its waters flow past with their eternal rhythm. As he gazed upon the familiar scene, 7 cows emerged from the water, each one perfect in its beauty and fat with good pasture. Their coats gleamed in the dreamlight, and their presence spoke of abundance and prosperity. These magnificent creatures moved with stately grace to feed among the reeds that grew along the riverbank, their contentment reflecting the peace and plenty that had blessed Egypt during Pharaoh's reign. But as the king watched in growing unease, 7 other cows rose from the same water's creatures so thin and gaunt that their bones showed through their skin like shadows of death itself. These emaciated animals bore the marks of famine and want, their eyes hollow with a hunger that seemed to encompass more than mere physical need. To Pharaoh's horror, the 7 lean cows devoured the 7 fat ones completely, yet remained as thin and wasted as before, as if the abundance they had consumed had vanished into some bottomless void. The image was so disturbing that it jolted Pharaoh from sleep, his heart racing and his garments damp with perspiration. Yet when he looked around his chamber, all was as before. The golden vessels still gleamed in their places. The incense still burned sweetly before the images of the gods, and the night remained peaceful around his palace. Gradually his breathing slowed, and he convinced himself that it had been merely a dream, born of too much rich food before sleep, or perhaps the pressure of ruling a vast kingdom. But when slumber claimed him again, another vision came, even more vivid and troubling than the first. This time Pharaoh found himself in a field of grain that stretched to the horizon, golden stalks swaying in a gentle breeze under a benevolent sun. 7 ears of corn grew on a single stalk, each one plump and full, heavy with grain that promised abundant harvests and filled granaries. The sight should have brought him joy, for such abundance was every ruler's dream, speaking of prosperity that would make his people content and his kingdom secure. But even as he admired this vision of plenty, 7 other ears sprouted on the same stalk ears that were thin and withered, blasted by an east wind that seemed to carry the breath of desolation itself. These pathetic specimens of grain bore no substance, no promise of nourishment or life. Yet as Pharaoh watched in mounting dread, these thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears, consuming completely the abundance that had seemed so secure moments before. Again, Pharaoh awakened with a start, his spirit troubled by images that seemed to carry significance far beyond their immediate appearance. These were not ordinary dreams born of a restless mind, but visions that bore the weight of prophecy, the authority of divine communication. The king of Egypt, master of the mightiest kingdom on earth, found himself face to face with mysteries that his earthly power could not solve. As dawn painted the eastern sky with colours of rose and gold, Pharaoh summoned all the magicians and wise men of Egypt to his presence. These were men renowned throughout the ancient world for their knowledge of hidden things, interpreters of omens and readers of signs, keepers of wisdom that had been passed down through generations of learned priests and scholars. Surely, the king reasoned, among all this accumulated wisdom, someone could unlock the meaning of his troubling dreams. The magicians came in their robes of office, bearing the symbols of their craft and the confidence of their long study. The wise men gathered with their scrolls and their formulas, their complicated systems for interpreting the language of dreams and visions. Pharaoh recounted his dreams to them with careful attention to every detail, hoping that their expertise would transform his anxiety into understanding. Yet as the hours passed and the learned men consulted their texts and debated among themselves, it became clear that these visions lay beyond their ability to interpret. The dreams seemed to mock their wisdom, remaining as mysterious as hieroglyphs written in an unknown language. The king's frustration grew as each supposed expert admitted failure, until the very throne room seemed to echo with the inadequacy of human wisdom when faced with divine communication. It was then that the chief cupbearer, standing among the court officials and watching his master's distress, felt the stirring of long-dormant memory. Like morning light breaking through darkness, he remembered the young Hebrew prisoner who had unlocked the mystery of his own dream 2 years before. The recollection came with a flush of shame, for he realized how completely he had forgotten his promise to mention Joseph to Pharaoh. With trembling voice, the cupbearer approached his sovereign and spoke words that would change the course of history. "I remember my offences today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. When we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about." Hope kindled in Pharaoh's heart like a flame touched to dry tinder. Here at last might be the key to unlock the mysteries that had robbed him of peace. Without delay, he sent messengers to the prison, commanding that Joseph be brought before him with all speed. The young Hebrew was hastily shaved and clothed in garments befitting one who would stand before the throne of Egypt, then brought swiftly to the palace where destiny awaited. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh in the great hall of audience, surrounded by the splendor of the most powerful kingdom on earth, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength refined by years of trial. The king looked upon this young man and said, "I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph's response revealed both the source of his gift and the humility that years of suffering had taught him. "It is not in me," he replied, his voice clear and respectful. "God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." In these simple words lay the foundation of all true wisdom, the recognition that human insight, however gifted, is merely the vessel through which divine revelation flows. As Pharaoh recounted his dreams of the cows and the grain, speaking of abundance devoured by famine and plenty swallowed by want, Joseph listened with the focused attention of one who knew that the words he was hearing carried the weight of nations in their meaning. When the king had finished, silence filled the great hall as everyone waited for the young Hebrew's response. The interpretation that came to Joseph was clear and unmistakable, flowing through his consciousness like water from a spring that has its source in divine wisdom itself. "The dream of Pharaoh is one," he began, his voice carrying quiet authority. "God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine." The meaning unfolded like a scroll being opened, revealing truths that would reshape the destiny of Egypt and all the surrounding nations. Joseph continued, his words painting a picture of the immediate future with prophetic clarity. "There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe." The repetition of the dream in 2 forms, Joseph explained, signified the certainty of divine purpose. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. The words carried the finality of divine decree, the unchangeable nature of heaven's plans for earth. But Joseph did not stop with interpretation alone. Moved by wisdom that came from his own experience of God's providence working through human suffering, he offered counsel that would prove as valuable as the revelation itself. "Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine." The plan was so practical, so perfectly suited to meet the crisis that the dreams had foretold, that it carried its own evidence of divine inspiration. Pharaoh and all his servants recognized in Joseph's words not merely human cleverness, but the wisdom of heaven applied to earthly needs. The young Hebrew who had been forgotten in prison was about to become the instrument of salvation for the most powerful nation on earth. As Pharaoh looked upon Joseph, this interpreter of dreams who had unlocked mysteries that all the wisdom of Egypt could not solve, he recognized that the very man who had revealed the crisis was also the one chosen to meet it. "Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God?" he asked his counselors. Then turning to Joseph, he spoke words that would elevate the Hebrew from prisoner to prince in a single moment. "Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." With these words, Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. He made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." The dreams of Joseph's youth, which had seemed like cruel mockeries during his years of slavery and imprisonment, suddenly blazed forth as prophecies fulfilled. The sheaves of grain bowing down, the sun and moon and stars doing obeisance, all had been preparation for this moment when divine purpose would be revealed in its fullness. So Joseph was set over all the land of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself, and the work of preparing for the coming famine began immediately. During the 7 years of abundance that followed, grain was stored in quantities beyond measure, like the sand of the sea, until they ceased to measure it, for it was beyond measure. The land flourished under Joseph's wise administration, and the granaries filled to overflowing with the surplus of unprecedented harvests. But even as the storehouses grew heavy with grain, Joseph remembered the dreams that had brought him to this place of authority. He knew that the years of plenty were merely preparation for the greater test that lay ahead. The famine would come exactly as revealed in Pharaoh's vision, and when it did, the wisdom gained through interpretation of dreams would become the salvation not only of Egypt, but of all the nations that would come seeking food during the years of want. The story of Joseph's elevation through dream interpretation would become one of the most beloved tales of divine providence, showing how God can use even betrayal and imprisonment to accomplish purposes that extend far beyond human understanding. The young man who had once dreamed of his brother's sheaves bowing down would indeed see them prostrate themselves before him, not in humiliation, but in desperate need for the grain that his wisdom had preserved. The dreams had been fulfilled, but their true significance lay not in personal vindication, but in the salvation of multitudes who would live because one man had been faithful to the gift of interpreting visions that come from heaven. Through dreams rightly understood, famine was transformed from destroyer to teacher, and want became the occasion for revealing the abundance of divine provision for those who trust in the wisdom that comes from above. Centuries flowed by like the great rivers of Mesopotamia, carrying with them the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of kings, the endless procession of human ambition and divine intervention. In the mighty city of Babylon, where towers reached toward heaven and gardens hung suspended between earth and sky, there ruled a king whose power seemed to encompass the known world. Nebuchadnezzar was his name, and his glory was like the sun at midday, blazing across the ancient lands with such intensity that other nations existed only in his shadow. Yet even this greatest of earthly monarchs found his peace troubled by visions that visited him in the vulnerable hours of sleep. The dream came to him on a night when the city lay quiet beneath a canopy of stars, when even the distant sounds of revelry had faded and the palace rested in the deep silence that precedes dawn. In his sleep, Nebuchadnezzar saw an image of such terrible magnificence that it shook the very foundations of his understanding. The figure that appeared in his dream was a colossus of staggering proportions, a statue that seemed to tower above the earth itself. Its head was of fine gold, gleaming with a purity that caught and reflected light like captured sunlight. The chest and arms were of silver, noble and bright, speaking of strength and value beyond measure. Its middle and thighs were of bronze, darker but still precious, carrying the weight of the upper portions with dignity and power. As Nebuchadnezzar's dreaming eyes travelled down this magnificent form, he saw that the legs were of iron, strong and unyielding, capable of bearing tremendous weight and dealing crushing blows to any opposition. But strangest of all Were the feet partly of iron and partly of clay, an unsettling mixture that seemed to speak of weakness hidden within apparent strength, of fundamental instability beneath an imposing exterior? The great image stood before him in awesome splendor, yet even as the king marveled at its beauty and grandeur, something else appeared in his vision. A stone, cut without hands from a distant mountain, began to roll toward the statue with inexorable purpose. Though it seemed small compared to the towering colossus, this stone carried within it a power that made the mighty image tremble. When it struck the feet of iron and clay, the entire structure collapsed with a sound like thunder, crumbling into fragments so fine that the wind carried them away like chaff from a threshing floor. But the stone that had destroyed the image did not remain small. It grew with miraculous speed, expanding until it became a great mountain that filled the whole earth, its presence transforming the very landscape of the king's vision. Where once the golden image had stood in solitary majesty, now there was only this mountain of divine origin, speaking of a kingdom that would never be destroyed, never give way to another, never know the corruption that had brought low the statue of mingled metals. When Nebuchadnezzar awakened, the dream clung to his consciousness with the persistence of prophecy. Every detail remained vivid and clear: the gleaming gold, the noble silver, the strong bronze, the iron legs, the unstable feet, and above all, the stone that had brought destruction and then growth beyond imagining. The vision carried a weight that the king's spirit recognized even when his mind could not grasp its meaning. This was no ordinary dream born of too much wine or rich food, but a message from the realm beyond human understanding. Troubled beyond measure, Nebuchadnezzar summoned all the wise men of Babylon, the magicians and enchanters, the sorcerers and Chaldeans who claimed mastery over the mysteries of earth and heaven. These were men trained from childhood in the ancient arts of interpretation, keepers of wisdom that had been passed down through generations of learned priests and scholars. Surely, the king reasoned, among all this accumulated knowledge, someone could unlock the meaning of his troubling vision. But when these supposed masters of hidden things gathered in the royal presence, Nebuchadnezzar presented them with a challenge that revealed the true extent of his disturbance. "I have had a dream," he announced, "and my spirit is troubled to know the dream." The wise men, confident in their abilities, responded with the expected words, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation." It was then that Nebuchadnezzar revealed the depth of his need and the test he would apply to their claimed wisdom. "The word from me is firm," he declared. "If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and its interpretation." The wise men were astounded by this impossible demand. How could they interpret a dream they had never heard described? "There is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand," they protested, "for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh." Their confession of inadequacy sent Nebuchadnezzar into a fury that threatened to sweep away all the supposed wisdom of his kingdom. He issued a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be destroyed, for if they could not meet this test, what value was their claimed knowledge of hidden things? The executioner's sword was sharpened, and the sentence of death fell not only upon those who had failed the king's test, but upon all who bore the title of wise men in the realm. Among those marked for death was a young Hebrew exile named Daniel, who had been taken from Jerusalem in his youth and trained in the wisdom of the Chaldeans. When the king's guard came to execute him along with his companions, Daniel spoke with such wisdom and discretion that he gained permission to approach the throne and ask for time to provide the king with the interpretation he demanded. That night, Daniel and his 3 friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego gathered to pray with the intensity of men whose lives hung in the balance. They sought not their own preservation, but divine revelation of the mystery that had troubled the king's sleep. They understood that only God could reveal what no human wisdom could discover. Only heaven could unlock the secrets that earthly learning could not penetrate. Their prayer was answered in the watches of the night, when the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision as clear as sunlight breaking through clouds. Not only did he see Nebuchadnezzar's dream in perfect detail, but understanding came with it, the interpretation that would save not only his life and the lives of his friends, but all the wise men of Babylon who faced execution for their failure. When morning came, Daniel stood before the king with the confidence of one who had received revelation from the source of all wisdom. No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. He began, "But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days." With careful reverence, Daniel recounted the dream exactly as Nebuchadnezzar had experienced it. The great image with its head of gold, chest and arms of silver, middle and thighs of bronze, legs of iron and feet of mixed iron and clay. He described the stone cut without hands, its devastating impact upon the statue's feet, the complete destruction of the image, and the growth of the stone into a mountain that filled the earth. Then came the interpretation that would echo through the centuries, revealing the rise and fall of empires yet to come. "You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might and the glory," Daniel explained, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "You are the head of gold." The golden head represented Nebuchadnezzar's own Babylonian empire, magnificent in its glory, but destined to give way to lesser kingdoms that would follow. The silver chest and arms spoke of another kingdom that would arise after Babylon, inferior in glory, but still precious in its own right. The bronze middle and thighs represented a third kingdom that would rule over all the earth, while the iron legs signified a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, yet ultimately fragile because of its divided nature. "And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron," Daniel continued, "it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle." But the most significant part of the vision was yet to be explained, the stone cut without hands that would bring down the entire structure of human kingdoms. "And in the days of those kings," Daniel proclaimed, "the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever." The dream had been a divine panorama of history, showing how earthly power, no matter how magnificent, would eventually give way to a kingdom established not by human hands, but by the direct intervention of heaven itself. The stone represented this eternal kingdom, small in its beginning, but destined to grow until it filled the entire earth with its influence and authority. Nebuchadnezzar recognized the truth of the interpretation even as it was spoken. The dream that had troubled his sleep was indeed from the God of heaven, and Daniel had unlocked its meaning with perfect accuracy. Overcome with awe, the great king fell prostrate before the young Hebrew exile, acknowledging that his God was indeed the God of gods and the Lord of kings, a revealer of mysteries who had chosen to communicate through the medium of dreams. As a reward for his interpretation, Daniel was elevated to high position in the kingdom, placed over all the wise men of Babylon, and given authority second only to the king himself. His 3 friends were also promoted to positions of honor, and the threatened execution of the wise men was cancelled. The dream had not only revealed the future course of history, but had also demonstrated once again that divine wisdom surpasses all human learning, that the God who communicates through visions and dreams remains sovereign over the kingdoms of earth. Years would pass, and other dreams would come to trouble Nebuchadnezzar's sleep, each one carrying its own message about the nature of divine authority and human pride. But this first great vision of the image and the stone would remain as a testament to the truth that earthly kingdoms, however glorious, are merely temporary manifestations of power, while the kingdom established by heaven endures forever, growing from the smallest beginnings to encompass all creation in its peaceful reign. The memory of that divine stone would comfort countless believers through the centuries, reminding them that apparent defeat often precedes ultimate victory, that small beginnings can lead to eternal significance, and that the kingdoms of this world shall indeed become the kingdom of our Lord, established not through the wisdom of men, but through the mysterious purposes of heaven, revealed to those who have eyes to see and hearts to understand the language of divine dreams. In the holy city of Jerusalem, where the temple of the Lord stood gleaming white against the azure sky, and the smoke of sacrifice rose daily toward heaven like prayers made visible, there lived a young man whose encounter with the divine would transform him from priest to prophet in a single overwhelming moment. Isaiah, son of Amos, moved through the familiar routines of temple service, tending the sacred fires and maintaining the vessels of worship, unaware that his life was about to be forever changed by a vision that would lift him beyond the boundaries of earthly experience. The year was heavy with sorrow, for King Uzziah had died after a long reign that had brought prosperity and peace to the kingdom of Judah. The people mourned their departed monarch, and uncertainty hung over the land like morning mist. It was in this time of transition and grief that Isaiah entered the temple for what he thought would be another day of ordinary service, another quiet offering of prayer and dedication in the familiar sanctuary where his fathers had worshipped before him. But as Isaiah moved through the sacred chambers, the very air around him began to shimmer with supernatural presence. The walls of the earthly temple seemed to dissolve, revealing a sight that struck him with such awe that his knees nearly buckled beneath him. He found himself gazing into the throne room of the universe itself, where the Lord sat in majesty that made all earthly grandeur seem like shadows cast by the true light. The throne was high and lifted up, rising above all created things with an authority that needed no earthly symbols to declare its sovereignty. Upon it sat the Lord himself, clothed in robes whose hem filled the entire temple, flowing with such abundance that they seemed to encompass all of creation within their folds. The sight was so overwhelming that Isaiah could not look directly upon the divine face, yet he was aware of a presence so holy, so utterly pure, that his own sinfulness became painfully apparent by contrast. Above the throne flew the seraphim, beings of such beauty and terror that they seemed to be made of living flame itself. Each had 6 wings that moved with perfect grace. With 2 they covered their faces, unable to look upon the divine glory even in their exalted state. With 2 they covered their feet in humble reverence. And with 2 they flew, moving through the heavenly realm with purpose that spoke of missions beyond human understanding. As these magnificent creatures moved in their eternal dance of worship, they called to one another with voices that shook the very foundations of the temple. "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts," they cried, their words carrying such power that the posts of the doors moved at their voice and the house was filled with smoke. "The whole earth is full of his glory." The triple declaration of holiness reverberated through Isaiah's consciousness like thunder rolling across mountains. This was not merely a statement of fact, but a revelation of the essential nature of divinity itself, holy beyond all comprehension, set apart from everything created, pure in a way that made all other purity seem stained by comparison. The repetition emphasized the absoluteness of this holiness, its complete otherness from anything in human experience. Yet even as the seraphim declared that the whole earth was full of God's glory, Isaiah became acutely aware of his own unworthiness to witness such a scene. The glory that filled the earth was invisible to most eyes, hidden by the veil of ordinary experience, yet here it blazed forth in its full intensity, revealing by contrast the deep sinfulness that marked all human existence. "Woe is me," Isaiah cried out, his voice breaking with the agony of recognition. "For I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." The words were torn from his heart by the overwhelming realization of what it meant to stand in the presence of absolute purity while bearing the stain of sin. The young priest had thought himself righteous, dedicated to the service of God, faithful in his duties and sincere in his devotion. But confronted with true holiness, all his supposed righteousness crumbled like garments consumed by fire. He saw himself as he truly was, not merely imperfect, but actively corrupted, not merely flawed, but fundamentally separated from the divine nature by the weight of his own sinfulness. But the vision was not merely one of judgment and condemnation. Even as Isaiah cried out in despair, one of the seraphim flew to him with swift compassion, carrying in his hand a burning coal taken from the altar of sacrifice. The angel approached without fear or revulsion, moved by the same divine love that had ordained this encounter. With the glowing coal, he touched Isaiah's lips, the very place where the young man had confessed his uncleanness. "Behold, this has touched your lips," the seraphim declared, his voice carrying the authority of heaven itself. "Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for." The burning coal, instead of destroying, brought purification. The fire that might have consumed brought instead cleansing and renewal. Isaiah felt the transforming power of divine forgiveness flowing through his being, washing away not only the guilt of his sins, but their very power to separate him from the holy presence of God. With his purification came a new ability to remain conscious in the divine presence, to function as a messenger between heaven and earth. No longer was he overwhelmed by his own unworthiness, for that unworthiness had been addressed by divine grace. Instead, he found himself able to hear and respond to the voice of the Lord himself as it spoke in the throne room of the universe. "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" The divine voice carried both majesty and invitation, sovereignty and appeal. It was the voice of one who, though needing no human assistance, chose to work through human agents, who invited mortal beings to participate in the eternal purposes of heaven. Without hesitation, Isaiah responded with words that would echo through the centuries as the pattern of prophetic calling, "Here am I, send me." The young priest who had entered the temple in routine service now stood ready to leave as a prophet commissioned by the highest authority in the universe. His lips, once confessed as unclean, had been purified to speak the very words of God to a people who desperately needed to hear them. The commission that followed was both glorious and sobering. Isaiah would be sent to speak divine truth to his people, yet the message would often fall on deaf ears and hard hearts. He would prophesy of coming judgment and distant hope, of exile and restoration, of a suffering servant who would bear the sins of many, and of a kingdom that would know no end. His words would comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, revealing both the justice and the mercy of the God who had called him. But none of the difficulties that lay ahead could diminish the transforming power of that moment in the temple when heaven had opened before his eyes. Isaiah had seen the Lord high and lifted up, had heard the song of the seraphim, had experienced both the terror of divine holiness and the wonder of divine grace. That vision would sustain him through decades of prophetic ministry, providing an anchor of certainty in times when his message seemed unwelcome and his calling questioned. The coal from the altar had not only cleansed his lips, but had marked him forever as one who had stood in the presence of ultimate reality. He had seen behind the veil that hides the glory of God from ordinary sight, had witnessed the eternal worship that continues regardless of earthly circumstances, had learned that holiness and love are not opposing attributes, but facets of the same divine nature, revealed in different circumstances. From that day forward, Isaiah would speak not merely as a religious teacher or moral philosopher, but as one who had seen the source of all truth and beauty. His prophecies would carry the ring of authentic divine encounter. His words would pierce hearts and transform lives, and his visions of future glory would sustain generations of believers through their darkest hours. The temple vision had been not merely a personal mystical experience, but a commissioning for service that would impact the course of human history. As Isaiah left the temple that day, the ordinary world seemed somehow different, shot through with hints of the glory he had witnessed in that sacred moment. The sun still shone, the people still went about their daily business, the city still hummed with the activities of human life. Yet for eyes that had seen the Lord high and lifted up, all these familiar sights were transformed, revealing depths of meaning that had been invisible before. Heaven and earth were not separate realms, but interpenetrating realities, and the God whose glory filled all creation was actively involved in the smallest details of human existence. The vision had ended, but its effects would continue for the rest of Isaiah's life and far beyond. He had been given a glimpse of the eternal perspective that governs all earthly events, had learned that worship is the fundamental activity of the universe, and had discovered that divine holiness, far from being cold and distant, burns with a love so intense that it purifies everything it touches. This knowledge would inform every prophecy he would speak, every vision he would receive, every word of comfort or warning he would offer to a people who needed desperately to understand that their God was both transcendent and immanent, both high and lifted up, and intimately concerned with their daily struggles and ultimate destiny. By the rivers of Babylon, where the exiled people of Israel sat and wept when they remembered Zion, where the harps hung silent on the willow trees and songs of home were too painful to sing, the Lord raised up a prophet whose visions would surpass even the magnificent temple encounter of Isaiah in their complexity and otherworldly character. Ezekiel the priest found himself among the captives by the river Chebar, far from the temple where he had expected to serve, far from the land of his fathers, seemingly cut off from the presence of the God who had chosen Jerusalem as his dwelling place. It was there, in that place of exile and abandonment, that the heavens opened, and Ezekiel saw visions of God that would challenge every assumption about divine presence and shake the foundations of religious understanding. The God of Israel was not confined to the temple in Jerusalem, not limited by geographical boundaries or political circumstances, but was as present in Babylon as in the holy city, as active among the exiles as among those who remained in the land of promise. The vision came to him on a day when the wind was blowing from the north, carrying with it clouds that seemed different from ordinary weather, charged with supernatural significance. As Ezekiel watched, the cloud revealed itself as the vehicle of divine manifestation, glowing with fire that flickered within it and around it, creating patterns of light that spoke of purpose beyond natural phenomena. From the midst of the fire came the gleam of something like gleaming metal, as if heaven itself was approaching through the medium of storm and flame. As the mysterious cloud drew nearer, Ezekiel saw emerging from its heart 4 living creatures of such strange and wonderful appearance that his human language could barely contain their description. Each had the likeness of a man, but possessed 4 faces and 4 wings. Their feet were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, gleaming like burnished bronze. Under their wings were human hands, and their faces looked in 4 directions without the creatures themselves needing to turn. The faces were those of man, lion, ox, and eagle, representing the highest expressions of creation, the noblest forms of life that reflected different aspects of divine nature. The face of man spoke of intelligence and moral responsibility, the lion of royal authority and strength, the ox of faithful service and sacrifice, the eagle of swiftness and heaven-soaring vision. Together, they formed a perfect unity that encompassed all the virtues that creation could offer to its creator. Their wings were arranged so that two touched each other and two covered their bodies, and they moved with perfect coordination, each going straight forward without turning as they walked. The sound of their wings was like the sound of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the sound of tumult as of the noise of an army. When they stopped, they let down their wings, and their movement spoke of power held in perfect control, of strength that served rather than dominated. But even more mysterious than the living creatures themselves were the wheels that appeared beside them, wheels within wheels that gleamed like chrysolite and moved with the creatures as if they shared the same spirit. The rims of the wheels were full of eyes, suggesting an awareness that encompassed all of creation, a divine intelligence that observed and understood every detail of existence. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved. When they rose from the earth, the wheels rose also, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Above the heads of the living creatures there was the likeness of a firmament, shining like crystal, awesome in its transparency and purity. And above the firmament over their heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire stone, reflecting the blue of heaven itself, speaking of sovereignty that bridged the gap between earth and sky. Upon this throne sat a figure with the appearance of a man, yet clearly more than human, surrounded by brightness that was like the appearance of the bow that is in the cloud on the day of rain. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, and when Ezekiel saw it, he fell on his face in worship and awe, overwhelmed by the magnificence of the divine presence that had chosen to reveal itself in this place of exile. The vision spoke of mobility and omnipresence, of a God who was not confined to temples made with hands, but who could manifest his presence wherever his people needed to encounter him. The living creatures with their multiple faces suggested the complexity of divine nature. The wheels within wheels spoke of purposes, within purposes that governed all existence, and the throne above it all declared that ultimate authority rested with the Lord, who had not abandoned his people even in their exile. From this throne came a voice that commissioned Ezekiel to be a prophet to the house of Israel, to speak words of judgment and restoration, to declare that the glory of the Lord was not diminished by political defeat or geographical displacement. The vision that began the prophet's ministry established the foundation for all his subsequent messages, that God remained sovereign over all nations, present with his people wherever they might be scattered, working even through exile and judgment to accomplish his eternal purposes. As the vision faded and Ezekiel found himself once again beside the river Chebar, surrounded by his fellow exiles, he carried within him the memory of sights that would inform every prophecy he would speak. He had seen the complexity of divine government, the mobility of divine presence, the certainty of divine sovereignty over all earthly circumstances. No longer could exile seem like abandonment. No longer could political defeat appear to be divine failure. The God who rode upon the cherubim and moved with wheels full of eyes was actively working even through apparent disasters to accomplish purposes that would ultimately result in restoration and renewal. The vision of the divine chariot throne would return to Ezekiel again and again throughout his prophetic ministry, sometimes revealing the departure of divine glory from the corrupted temple, sometimes showing the return of that glory to a renewed sanctuary. But always it would speak of the truth that had been revealed in that first overwhelming encounter by the river of exile, that the God of Israel transcended all human limitations and geographical boundaries, remaining present with his people and active in their lives regardless of their circumstances or location. For the exiles who heard Ezekiel's account of this vision, it brought comfort that surpassed understanding. They were not forgotten or abandoned, not cut off from divine presence or care. The same God who had appeared to Moses in the burning bush, who had revealed himself to Isaiah in the temple, had now manifested his glory by the waters of Babylon, proving that his love and faithfulness knew no bounds, that his purposes could not be thwarted by human rebellion or foreign conquest. The living creatures, the wheels, the throne, and the figure of divine glory became symbols of hope that sustained the people through long years of exile, reminding them that their present circumstances were not their final destiny, that the God who had revealed himself in such magnificent complexity was actively working to bring them home again, to restore what had been lost, to rebuild what had been destroyed, and to establish his kingdom in righteousness and peace that would never again be threatened by the limitations of human understanding or earthly power. In the courts of Babylon, where wisdom was prized above gold and knowledge of hidden things brought men to positions of great honor, there lived an aged prophet whose gift of interpreting dreams had made him famous throughout the empire. Daniel, now bearing the Babylonian name Belteshazzar, had served faithfully through the reigns of multiple kings, his reputation for divine insight growing with each passing year. Though his hair had grown white and his step had slowed, his ability to unlock the mysteries revealed in nocturnal visions remained as sharp as ever, for it depended not on human wisdom, but on connection to the source of all understanding. It was in the first year of Belshazzar's reign that Daniel himself became the recipient of a vision that would trouble his spirit for days and reveal the future course of world history with startling clarity. He had gone to sleep after a day of administrative duties, his mind occupied with the routine concerns of governing a province in the vast Babylonian Empire, unaware that the night would bring him face to face with prophecies that would stretch from his own time to the end of the age. In his dream, Daniel saw the great sea churned by the four winds of heaven, its waters tossing and roiling with supernatural turbulence that spoke of divine judgment working through the chaos of international politics. From this troubled sea arose four great beasts, each more terrible and strange than the last, each representing a kingdom that would rise to dominate the earth before giving way to the next in the predetermined succession of earthly powers. The first beast was like a lion but had eagle's wings, combining the strength of the king of beasts with the swiftness and height of the greatest of birds. As Daniel watched, the wings were plucked off, and the creature was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. This represented the Babylonian Empire in which Daniel lived, magnificent in its power, but destined to become more human, more limited, as time revealed the constraints that bound even the mightiest earthly kingdoms. The second beast was like a bear, raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told to arise and devour much flesh. This creature spoke of an empire that would follow Babylon, one characterized by massive strength and an insatiable appetite for conquest, consuming nations like a hungry beast, devouring its prey. The asymmetrical appearance suggested internal divisions that would characterize this future kingdom even as it achieved unprecedented expansion. The third beast was like a leopard, but had 4 wings of a bird upon its back and 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. This creature represented speed and cunning, the ability to move swiftly across vast distances and strike with lightning effectiveness. The 4 heads suggested division into multiple centers of power, while the wings spoke of rapid conquest that would characterize this third empire's rise to dominance over the known world. But it was the 4th beast that filled Daniel with the greatest awe and terror. Unlike the others, it could not be compared to any known animal, for it was different from all the beasts that were before it, exceedingly terrifying, with teeth of iron and claws of bronze. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what remained with its feet, demonstrating a capacity for destruction that surpassed even the notorious cruelty of ancient warfare. This fourth beast had 10 horns, representing 10 kings or kingdoms that would arise within its dominion. But as Daniel watched, another horn came up among them, a little one that uprooted 3 of the first horns to make room for itself. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth speaking great things, suggesting intelligence combined with arrogance, human cunning wedded to superhuman pride. The vision of the beasts filled Daniel with dread, for he understood that he was seeing the future course of world history, the succession of empires that would trample the earth under their feet and oppress the people of God. Each beast was more terrible than the last, suggesting that human government would become increasingly brutal and godless as time progressed toward its ultimate crisis. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm the aged prophet, the scene in his vision suddenly changed. Thrones were placed, suggesting divine judgment about to be executed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat with the majesty and authority of eternal sovereignty. His clothing was white as snow, speaking of absolute purity and righteousness, and the hair of his head was like pure wool, suggesting the wisdom that comes only with infinite age and experience. The throne of the Ancient of Days was fiery flames, burning with the holiness that could not tolerate sin or injustice, and its wheels were burning fire, suggesting the mobility of divine justice that could reach any corner of creation to execute righteous judgment. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him, carrying divine wrath to consume all that opposed the will of heaven, while thousands served him and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him, an innumerable host of heavenly beings ready to execute his commands. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened, containing the complete record of every deed performed under heaven, every word spoken in earth's long history, every thought harboured in human hearts. Nothing was hidden from the divine knowledge. Nothing could escape the perfect justice that was about to be revealed. As Daniel watched in breathless anticipation, judgment was pronounced upon the beast with the great horn, and it was slain, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. The other beasts had their dominion taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time, suggesting that while their power would be broken, something of their influence would continue until the final establishment of divine kingdom. But the fourth beast, that most terrible of all earthly powers, would be completely destroyed, eliminated so thoroughly that no trace of its influence would remain. Then came the climax of the vision, the sight that would forever change Daniel's understanding of God's ultimate purpose in history. With the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, a figure who appeared human, yet clearly possessed more than human authority and glory. He came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him with all the ceremony befitting the transfer of ultimate power. To this Son of Man was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, but not a kingdom like those represented by the beasts. This was dominion that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, authority that was everlasting and would not pass away, a kingdom that would never be destroyed. Where earthly kingdoms rose and fell in endless succession, this divine kingdom would endure forever, never giving way to another, never knowing corruption or defeat. The vision ended, but its impact upon Daniel was profound and lasting. He approached one of the attendants in his dream and asked for the truth concerning all these things, and the interpretation was given to him with clarity that left no room for doubt. The 4 great beasts were 4 kings who would arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High would receive the kingdom and possess it forever, for ages without end. The explanation of the 4th beast was particularly detailed and sobering. It would be different from all other kingdoms, devouring the whole earth and trampling it down and breaking it to pieces. The 10 horns represented 10 kings who would arise, and another would arise after them who would be different from the former ones and would subdue 3 kings. This final ruler would speak words against the Most High and wear out the saints of the Most High, attempting to change times and law, and the saints would be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court would sit in judgment, and his dominion would be taken away, consumed and destroyed to the end. Then the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven would be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom would be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions would serve and obey them. When the vision was complete and Daniel awoke, he found that his thoughts troubled him greatly, and his colour changed, but he kept the matter in his heart. The aged prophet had been given a panoramic view of history from his own time to the end of the age, had seen the rise and fall of empires and the ultimate triumph of divine kingdom over all earthly powers. The knowledge was both burden and blessing, revealing trials that lay ahead for the people of God, but also the certainty of final victory. The vision of the 4 beasts and the Son of Man would become one of the most significant prophecies in all Scripture, quoted and referenced throughout subsequent revelation as the framework for understanding the course of world history and the ultimate establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Daniel had been given not merely a glimpse of the future, but a divine perspective on the meaning of history itself, the assurance that apparent chaos and injustice were working together toward a predetermined end when righteousness would reign supreme and the saints of the Most High would inherit the earth. As Daniel pondered the implications of what he had seen, he understood that his role was not merely to interpret the dreams of earthly kings, but to preserve for future generations the divine revelation of how all earthly kingdoms would ultimately yield to the sovereignty of heaven. The beasts might rage and the nations conspire, but the Ancient of Days remained on his throne, and the Son of Man would receive his kingdom in the fullness of time, bringing peace and justice that would never end. On the rocky island of Patmos, where the Aegean Sea stretched endlessly toward distant horizons, and the only sounds were the crying of seabirds and the constant rhythm of waves against stone, an aged apostle found himself alone with God in circumstances he had never anticipated. John, the beloved disciple who had once leaned against the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper, now lived in exile for the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ, separated from the churches he loved and the people he had served for decades. It was the Lord's Day, that sacred time when Christians throughout the empire gathered to remember the resurrection and celebrate the presence of their risen Saviour, and John's heart was heavy with longing for fellowship he could no longer enjoy. The isolation of exile weighed upon him like a physical burden, yet it was precisely in this place of separation that he would receive the most magnificent revelation ever granted to human eyes, a vision that would comfort countless believers through the ages and reveal the ultimate triumph of divine love over all the powers of darkness. As John walked along the shore of his island prison, his mind filled with prayers for the churches under his care, he suddenly became aware of a presence behind him, a sound like a great trumpet that seemed to come from heaven itself. The voice that spoke was one he recognized with joy that flooded his entire being, for it was the voice of his beloved Master, but transformed and glorified beyond anything he had experienced during their earthly fellowship. "Write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches," the voice commanded, and John turned to see the source of this divine communication. What he beheld exceeded every vision that had ever been granted to prophet or seer. For standing among 7 golden lampstands was one like a son of man, clothed with a robe reaching to his feet, and girded around the chest with a golden sash. The head and hair of this glorious figure were white like white wool, like snow, speaking of the eternal nature that had existed before time began and would continue after time had ended. His eyes were like a flame of fire, penetrating and pure, able to see into the deepest recesses of human hearts and pierce through every deception and facade. His feet were like burnished bronze refined in a furnace, suggesting strength that could not be shaken and purity that had been tested and proven perfect. His voice was like the sound of many waters, carrying the authority of oceans and the power of rivers in flood, yet somehow familiar and comforting to the one who heard it. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword, representing the word of God that divides between truth and falsehood, light and darkness, righteousness and sin. His face shone like the sun in its strength, blazing with glory that mortal eyes could barely endure. When John saw this transformed vision of his beloved Lord, he fell at his feet as though dead, overwhelmed by the majesty and holiness that blazed before him. But immediately he felt the familiar touch of the hand that had blessed children and healed the sick, and heard the voice that had spoken peace to troubled hearts. "Fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive for evermore, and I have the keys of death and Hades." These words brought comfort that penetrated to the very depths of John's being. The Jesus he had known and loved during their earthly ministry had not been diminished by death, but had conquered it completely, emerging with authority over the very forces that seemed to triumph in a world filled with persecution and suffering. Death itself had become a defeated enemy, and the keys of its domain were held by the one who had experienced its power and broken it forever. The vision that followed would encompass not only the immediate concerns of the 7 churches in Asia, but the entire sweep of history from John's time to the end of the age. He would see the throne room of heaven opened before him, witness the worship that never ceases around the seat of divine majesty, observe the breaking of seals that would reveal the judgments of God upon a rebellious world, and watch the final triumph of righteousness over all the forces of evil. In the throne room of heaven, John saw the one who sat upon the throne, whose appearance was like jasper and carnelian, surrounded by a rainbow that looked like an emerald, speaking of the covenant faithfulness that would endure through all the storms of judgment that were to come. Around the throne were 24 thrones with 24 elders clothed in white garments with golden crowns upon their heads, representing the complete people of God from every age and nation. From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, signs of the divine power that governed all creation, while before the throne burned 7 torches of fire, which were the 7 spirits of God. The sea of glass-like crystal spread before the throne, speaking of the purity and transparency that characterized the heavenly realm, while 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind offered ceaseless worship to the one who lives forever and ever. These living creatures, like those seen by Ezekiel centuries before, had faces like a lion, an ox, a man, and a flying eagle, representing all creation united in adoration of their Creator. Day and night they never ceased to say, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come," their worship creating an eternal symphony of praise that set the rhythm for all other activities in heaven. Whenever the living creatures gave glory and honor and thanks to the one who sits on the throne, the 24 elders fell down before him and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, "Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created." This continuous cycle of worship revealed the proper relationship between Creator and creation, the recognition of divine sovereignty that would characterize the redeemed throughout eternity. But the central focus of heavenly worship was the Lamb who had been slain, Jesus Christ himself, who alone was worthy to open the scroll sealed with 7 seals that contained the destiny of creation. When he took the scroll from the right hand of the one who sat on the throne, all heaven erupted in new songs of praise. "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." The vision revealed not only the present reality of heavenly worship, but the future completion of God's plan for creation. John saw the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband, representing the eternal dwelling place where God would live with his people forever. In this holy city there would be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the former things would have passed away completely. The river of the water of life flowed through the city, bright as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb, while on either side of the river grew the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, and its leaves were for the healing of the nations. No longer would there be any curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb would be in the city, and his servants would worship him face to face, seeing his glory without the veil that now hides it from mortal eyes. The night would be no more in that eternal city, for the Lord God would be their light, and they would reign forever and ever in perfect harmony with divine purposes. This was the ultimate fulfillment of every dream and vision that had ever been granted to humanity, the final answer to every prayer that had ever been offered, the complete realization of the kingdom that prophets had glimpsed in shadowy symbols, but which would at last be revealed in all its glory. As John received these revelations on his island of exile, he understood that he was being shown not merely future events, but the eternal perspective that gives meaning to all earthly experiences. The sufferings of the present time, however severe, were but temporary afflictions that were preparing the way for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. The churches that faced persecution and the believers who endured hardship were not forgotten or abandoned, but were participants in a cosmic drama that would ultimately vindicate divine justice and reveal the perfect love that had planned their redemption before the foundation of the world. The visions that came to John on Patmos would provide comfort and strength to countless generations of believers who faced their own times of trial and exile. In seasons of darkness, they would remember the throne room where worship never ceases, the Lamb who conquered through sacrifice, the promise of a new heaven and new earth where righteousness dwells forever. The dreams and visions recorded in Scripture would continue to speak to human hearts, reminding them that the God who communicates through the mysterious realm of sleep and vision remains actively involved in the affairs of earth, working all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Through the dreams of Adam and Jacob, the visions of Joseph and Daniel, the temple encounter of Isaiah, and the riverside revelation of Ezekiel, the divine voice had been speaking across the centuries, revealing glimpses of eternal truth that transcended the limitations of any single age or culture. Each vision had added its own unique perspective to the great tapestry of divine revelation, showing how heaven touches earth in moments of supernatural encounter that transform ordinary lives into channels of eternal purpose. The aged apostle on Patmos had been given the final and most complete vision, the culmination of all that had been revealed before, the ultimate hope that would sustain the people of God through whatever trials might come. As he carefully recorded the words he had heard and the sights he had seen, John knew that he was preserving not merely his own experience, but a message for every generation that would follow. A reminder that the God who speaks in dreams and visions has purposes that extend far beyond the present moment into the endless ages of eternity. In the gentle rhythm of waves against the shore and the soft whisper of wind through the rocks of Patmos, John could hear echoes of the divine voice that had commissioned him to write these things. The island that had seemed like a place of punishment and isolation had become a gateway to heaven itself, a quiet sanctuary where the veil between time and eternity had been drawn aside to reveal the glory that awaits all who trust in the one who holds the keys of death and Hades. As night settled over the island and the stars appeared in their ancient patterns overhead, John rested in the peace that comes from having seen the end from the beginning, from knowing that every dream and vision granted to the servants of God pointed toward the same glorious conclusion. The kingdoms of this world would indeed become the kingdom of their Lord and of his Christ, and he would reign forever and ever, bringing to perfect fulfillment every promise that had been spoken through the prophets, and every hope that had been kindled in human hearts through the mysterious gift of divine dreams. The story of dreams and visions that began in a garden where man first slept in divine peace would find its completion in a city where sleep would be no more, where the light of God's presence would make every moment a conscious participation in eternal joy. Until that day came, the record of these sacred encounters would continue to speak to all who had ears to hear, reminding them that the boundary between heaven and earth is thinner than they might imagine, and that the God who created them continues to communicate with them through the language of dreams and the poetry of divine vision. In the silence of night, when the concerns of day give way to the mysteries of sleep, the same divine voice that spoke to Adam and Jacob, to Joseph and Daniel, to Isaiah and Ezekiel, to John on his island of exile, continues to whisper words of comfort and hope to all who will listen. The dreams may come clothed in the symbols of contemporary life. The visions may use the imagery of modern times, but the message remains the same. God has not forgotten his people. His purposes will not be thwarted, and his kingdom will come in perfect fulfillment of every promise he has made. The golden thread that connects all these sacred visions is the unchanging nature of divine love, manifested through the mysterious realm where consciousness meets the eternal. In each dream, in every vision, the same tender care that formed Adam from dust and breathed into him the breath of life continues to reach out to humanity with messages of hope, guidance, and ultimate restoration. The God who walked with man in the cool of the evening in Eden's garden never ceased to seek communion with his creation, speaking through dreams when other forms of communication seemed impossible or inadequate. Consider how each dreamer was transformed by their encounter with the divine. Adam awakened to find his deepest longing fulfilled in the presence of Eve, understanding for the first time the meaning of complete companionship and love that mirrors the very nature of God himself. Jacob, the deceiver and fugitive, arose from his stone pillow to become Israel, the father of nations, carrying within him the certainty that divine promises are more reliable than human circumstances. Joseph, the dreaming youth who became a slave and prisoner, emerged as the savior of nations, demonstrating how God can use even betrayal and injustice to accomplish purposes beyond human understanding. The wisdom of divine dreams lies not merely in their ability to predict future events, though that gift is certainly present, but in their power to reveal the deeper spiritual realities that govern all existence. When Pharaoh dreamed of cattle and grain, he was seeing not merely agricultural cycles, but the fundamental principle that divine sovereignty governs even the most natural phenomena. When Nebuchadnezzar beheld the great image, he was witnessing not merely political succession, but the ultimate triumph of heaven's kingdom over all earthly powers. The prophets who received visions of divine glory, Isaiah in the temple, Ezekiel by the river, John on Patmos, were granted glimpses of the eternal worship that continues regardless of earthly circumstances. Their eyes were open to see beyond the veil that normally hides spiritual reality from human perception, and they discovered that heaven and earth are far more closely connected than ordinary experience suggests. The God who sits upon the throne, surrounded by the ceaseless worship of seraphim and living creatures, is the same God who numbers the hairs of human heads and notes the fall of every sparrow. These visions remind us that the boundary between the natural and supernatural is far more permeable than we often imagine. In sleep, when the defenses of rational consciousness are lowered and the soul becomes receptive to influences beyond the material world, divine communication flows most freely. Dreams become windows into eternity, moments when finite minds can receive infinite truth, occasions when earthly hearts can be touched by heavenly love. The comfort these stories provide extends far beyond their historical significance. They speak to every human heart that has ever felt isolated or abandoned, assuring us that we are never truly alone. When Jacob lay down in that desolate place with only a stone for a pillow, he thought himself cut off from family and homeland, fleeing the consequences of his own deception. Yet it was precisely there, in that place of apparent abandonment, that heaven opened and he discovered that the presence of God is not limited by geography or circumstances. Joseph's experience in the Egyptian prison demonstrates how God can use even the darkest seasons of life to prepare us for purposes we cannot yet imagine. The gifts that seemed like curses, the abilities that brought misunderstanding and persecution, the very circumstances that appeared to destroy his future became the instruments through which salvation would come to countless people. His story teaches us that divine timing often requires seasons of preparation that may seem like punishment, but are actually education in the deeper mysteries of divine providence. The dreams granted to earthly rulers, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, and others, reveal how God communicates with those who may not yet acknowledge his sovereignty, but whose decisions affect the lives of multitudes. Divine mercy extends even to those who do not know the source of their wisdom, providing guidance and warning to any who will receive it with humble hearts. The interpretations given by Joseph and Daniel demonstrate that true wisdom comes not from human learning, but from divine revelation, and that those who trust in God can speak truth to power without fear of consequence. In the temple visions of Isaiah and Ezekiel, we see the overwhelming nature of divine holiness and the transforming power of divine grace. Isaiah's confession of uncleanness and his subsequent purification with the burning coal show us that authentic encounter with God always begins with recognition of our own need for cleansing and transformation. The vision does not leave us condemned in our sinfulness, but provides the very means of purification that makes communion with divine holiness possible. Ezekiel's vision of the divine chariot throne, with its wheels within wheels and eyes that see everything, reminds us that God's governance of creation is far more complex and comprehensive than human understanding can grasp. The living creatures with their multiple faces suggest that divine nature encompasses all that is highest and best in creation, while the mobility of the throne demonstrates that divine presence is not confined to any particular location, but can manifest wherever it is needed most. Daniel's visions of future kingdoms and their ultimate replacement by eternal divine rule provide perspective on the apparently chaotic movements of history. What seems like random succession of empires and the triumph of evil over good is actually the working out of divine purposes that will culminate in perfect justice and eternal peace. The Ancient of Days remains on his throne throughout all earthly upheavals, and the books are always open before him, recording every deed and preparing for the final judgment that will set all things right. John's revelation on Patmos brings together all the themes that have run through Scripture's record of dreams and visions, showing their ultimate fulfillment in the complete restoration of creation to its intended purpose. The throne room worship that he witnessed reminds us that praise and adoration are the fundamental activities of the universe, the rhythm to which all creation moves in perfect harmony with divine will. The vision of the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven speaks of the complete healing of the breach between heaven and earth, the time when God will dwell with humanity in perfect fellowship, and every tear will be wiped away. Throughout all these visions runs the golden thread of divine faithfulness, the unbreakable commitment of God to the people he has chosen and the world he has created. No earthly power can ultimately frustrate divine purposes. No human rebellion can permanently separate creation from its creator. No depth of sin or suffering can exhaust the resources of divine love and grace. The dreams and visions serve as anchors of hope in times of storm, reminders that present circumstances do not determine eternal destiny, that apparent endings are often new beginnings in disguise. the language of dreams speaks to the deepest parts of human nature, bypassing the rational defenses that often prevent us from receiving spiritual truth. In symbols and images, in metaphor and vision, divine communication reaches into the innermost chambers of human consciousness, planting seeds of hope and understanding that may take years to fully flower, but which will ultimately transform our perspective on life and death, time and eternity, suffering and joy. As we reflect on these sacred narratives, we are reminded that the same God who spoke to the ancients through dreams and visions continues to communicate with humanity today. The methods may be different, the imagery may reflect contemporary rather than ancient cultures, but the heart of divine communication remains unchanged. God still seeks to comfort the troubled, guide the confused, warn the rebellious, and encourage the faithful through whatever means are necessary to reach human hearts with divine love. The peace that these stories bring is not merely emotional comfort, but the deep rest that comes from understanding our place in the cosmic order. We are not accidents of chance in a meaningless universe, but beloved children of the Creator who has purposes for our lives that extend far beyond our present understanding. The dreams that visit our own sleep may not carry the earth-shaking significance of biblical visions, but they participate in the same divine desire to communicate with creation, to bridge the gap between finite and infinite, temporal and eternal. In the gentle rhythm of breathing that marks the transition from wakefulness to sleep, we join the eternal dance of creation that began when God first spoke light into darkness, and will continue until every purpose of heaven has been accomplished on earth. The dreams that come to us in the quiet hours of night may carry messages of comfort for troubled hearts, guidance for difficult decisions, hope for discouraged spirits, or simply the assurance that we are held in divine love that will never let us go. The stories of biblical dreams and visions teach us to pay attention to the movements of our own souls, to recognize that the boundary between prayer and dream, between meditation and vision, is often thinner than we suppose. In the receptive state that comes with sincere seeking and humble trust, human consciousness becomes capable of receiving communications that transcend ordinary understanding, glimpses of eternal truth that can illuminate the path ahead and provide strength for whatever challenges may come. As sleep draws near and consciousness begins its daily journey into the mysterious realm of rest and renewal, we can rest assured that the God who never slumbers nor sleeps is watching over us with the same tender care that he showed to every dreamer and visionary recorded in Scripture. The angels who ascended and descended on Jacob's ladder continue their ministry of bringing heaven's resources to meet earth's needs, and the prayers that rise from believing hearts continue to find their way to the throne of grace, where mercy and help are always available in time of need. The vision of the New Jerusalem that John saw coming down from heaven reminds us that all earthly separations are temporary, that every goodbye is not forever, that the deepest longings of human hearts will one day be satisfied in ways that exceed our present ability to imagine. The tree of life that grows beside the river of living water speaks of eternal nourishment for every spiritual hunger, while the light that needs no sun or moon tells us that divine presence will be the source of all illumination in the age to come. Until that day arrives, the dreams and visions recorded in Scripture continue to speak their message of hope and comfort to all who will receive them. They remind us that we are part of a story that began before time and will continue after time has ended, participants in a divine drama that gives meaning and purpose to every moment of earthly existence. The God who formed us in our mother's womb, and who knows our thoughts before we think them, is actively working in our lives to accomplish purposes that will ultimately contribute to the establishment of his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. The gentle rhythm of divine communication through dreams reveals patterns that speak to the deepest needs of human nature. Each vision comes at precisely the moment when it is most needed, demonstrating the perfect timing that characterizes all divine interventions in human affairs. Adam's sleep came when loneliness had reached its fullest expression, when even paradise could not satisfy the longing for companionship that God himself had placed in the human heart. The timing of the divine gift shows us that God waits not out of indifference, but out of love, allowing desire to reach its proper intensity before providing the fulfillment that will be most deeply appreciated. Jacob's ladder appeared on the night when he was most conscious of his isolation, fleeing from the consequences of his deception and facing an uncertain future in a foreign land. The vision came not as a reward for righteousness, but as grace given to one who desperately needed assurance that he was not abandoned by the God of his fathers. This teaches us that divine communication often comes not to the spiritually accomplished, but to those who are most aware of their need, most conscious of their vulnerability, most open to receiving help from sources beyond their own resources. Joseph's dreams came in his youth, when the heart is most capable of receiving grand visions and the soul is most willing to believe in possibilities that seem impossible to mature cynicism. Yet the fulfillment of those dreams required decades of preparation, years of character development that could only come through trials that tested his faith and refined his understanding of divine purposes. The delay between vision and fulfillment teaches us patience and trust, reminding us that God's timing is perfect even when it seems slow to human perception. The dreams of Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar came to rulers at moments when their decisions would affect the lives of millions, demonstrating that divine communication extends beyond the community of faith to reach any heart that can receive and act upon heavenly wisdom. These visions remind us that God's concern extends to all humanity, that his purposes encompass entire nations and civilizations, not merely individual lives or particular religious communities. The visions granted to the prophets came during periods of national crisis when the people of God needed to understand that their apparent abandonment was actually divine discipline intended to restore them to their proper relationship with heaven. Isaiah's temple vision came in the year that King Uzziah died, a time of political uncertainty and spiritual confusion. Ezekiel's vision came during the exile in Babylon, when it seemed that God had forgotten his promises and abandoned his people to foreign oppression. John's revelation came during a period of intense persecution, when the early church faced the full might of Roman imperial power and needed assurance that their suffering had meaning and would not last forever. In each case, the timing of divine communication was perfectly coordinated with human need, arriving precisely when it would have maximum impact and provide the greatest comfort or guidance. This pattern teaches us to recognize that the apparent silence of heaven is not neglect but preparation, that divine communication comes in its proper season, like fruit ripening on a tree or flowers blooming in their appointed time. The symbols used in biblical dreams and visions speak a universal language that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries. The ladder reaching from earth to heaven appears in one form or another in the spiritual traditions of many peoples, speaking to the universal human longing for connection with transcendent reality. The image of light overcoming darkness, of stone becoming mountain, of beasts giving way to divine kingdom, resonates in human consciousness regardless of historical period or geographical location, because these symbols touch archetypal truths embedded in the very structure of created reality. Water appears repeatedly in these visions, the river beside which Ezekiel saw his vision, the sea from which Daniel's beasts emerged, the crystal sea before the throne in John's revelation, the river of life flowing through the New Jerusalem. Water speaks to the human soul of cleansing and renewal, of life-giving power and refreshing grace. It reminds us that divine communication comes like rain to thirsty ground, bringing restoration to parched spirits and causing new life to spring forth in places that seemed barren and hopeless. Fire is another recurring element, the burning coal that cleansed Isaiah's lips, the fiery stream flowing from the Ancient of Days, the flame-like eyes of the glorified Christ, the lake of fire that consumes all that opposes divine purpose. Fire speaks of purification and judgment, of the holiness that cannot tolerate sin, and the love that will not leave us unchanged. It reminds us that encounters with divine reality always involve transformation, that exposure to heavenly light reveals our need for cleansing while simultaneously providing the means for our purification. The presence of angels in these visions speaks to the reality of spiritual assistance that surrounds human life even when we are unaware of it. The angels ascending and descending on Jacob's ladder were not temporary visitors, but representatives of constant heavenly activity on behalf of earthly needs. The seraphim in Isaiah's vision were not created for that particular moment, but were continuing their eternal worship and service. The living creatures around the throne in John's Revelation had been offering their praise since before time began and would continue long after time ended. These angelic presences remind us that we are not alone in our struggles, that resources of heavenly power and wisdom are constantly available to those who learn to recognize and receive them. The angels serve as messengers and ministers, bridges between the finite and infinite, channels through which divine love and assistance flow to meet human need. Their appearance in dreams and visions assures us that the same spiritual support continues to be available to believers in every age. The transformation that follows authentic divine encounter is another consistent pattern throughout these sacred narratives. Adam awakened to a new understanding of love and companionship that changed his entire existence. Jacob arose from his stone pillow as a man marked by divine purpose, carrying within him the certainty of divine blessing that would sustain him through all future trials. Joseph emerged from his prison experience not bitter but wise, not vengeful but compassionate, prepared to save the very people who had betrayed him. Isaiah left the temple as a prophet commissioned by the highest authority in the universe, his lips purified and his heart prepared to speak divine truth regardless of the cost. Ezekiel carried from his riverside vision an understanding of divine mobility and presence that would comfort his fellow exiles and prepare them for eventual restoration. Daniel arose from his visions with knowledge of future history that would sustain the people of God through centuries of foreign domination and persecution. John returned from his Patmos revelation with comfort and hope that would strengthen countless generations of believers facing their own periods of trial and apparent defeat. In each case, the encounter with divine reality through dreams and visions produced not merely emotional comfort, but practical transformation that enabled the recipients to fulfill purposes far beyond their original limitations or expectations. This pattern of transformation through divine encounter continues to operate in the lives of those who remain open to heavenly communication. The God who spoke through dreams to the ancients has not ceased to communicate with humanity, but continues to reach out through whatever means are necessary to touch human hearts with divine love and guidance. The forms may change, the imagery may reflect contemporary rather than ancient cultures, but the essential pattern remains the same: divine love seeking human hearts, heavenly wisdom offered to earthly confusion, eternal purposes working through temporal circumstances. The comfort that flows from these ancient stories extends far beyond their historical significance to touch every human experience of isolation, confusion, or despair. When we face our own dark nights of the soul, when circumstances seem to contradict divine promises, when the future appears uncertain and the present overwhelming, these visions remind us that appearances can be deceiving, that divine purposes are often accomplished through means that seem contradictory to human wisdom, that apparent endings are frequently new beginnings in disguise. The patience required for the fulfillment of divine promises is beautifully illustrated in the long delays between vision and realization that characterize many of these stories. Joseph's dreams came in his youth, but were fulfilled only after decades of slavery and imprisonment. Daniel's visions of future kingdoms extended across centuries and even millennia before finding their complete fulfillment. John's revelation of the New Jerusalem still awaits its final realization in the age to come. These delays teach us that divine timing operates according to wisdom that surpasses human understanding, that the preparation required for the fulfillment of heavenly purposes often takes far longer than we expect or desire. The waiting periods are not empty spaces, but times of character development, spiritual growth, and practical preparation that ensure we will be ready to receive and properly use the gifts that God intends to bestow. The universal scope of divine concern revealed in these visions challenges any narrow understanding of God's love and purposes. Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar were pagan rulers, yet they received divine communication through dreams because their decisions would affect the welfare of multitudes. This demonstrates that God's care extends to all humanity, that his purposes encompass every nation and people, that his desire for communication transcends religious boundaries and cultural limitations. The practical wisdom embedded in these visions shows that divine communication is never merely mystical or otherworldly, but always includes guidance for dealing with earthly realities. Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams included detailed practical advice for managing the coming famine. Daniel's explanation of Nebuchadnezzar's vision included counsel about divine sovereignty and human pride. Isaiah's temple encounter led to specific prophetic ministry addressing the social and spiritual needs of his people. This integration of heavenly vision with earthly wisdom reminds us that authentic spiritual experience always produces practical fruit, that genuine encounters with divine reality enable us to live more effectively in the material world rather than escaping from it. The goal of divine communication is not to remove us from earthly responsibilities, but to equip us to fulfill them with wisdom and power that come from above. The recurring theme of divine sovereignty throughout these visions provides deep comfort to those who struggle with questions about the meaning and purpose of suffering. The Ancient of Days remains on his throne, regardless of earthly chaos. The wheels of divine purpose continue to turn, despite apparent setbacks. The ultimate triumph of righteousness is assured despite present injustices. These truths do not eliminate the reality of pain and loss, but provide a context of meaning that enables us to endure with hope rather than despair. The promise of eventual restoration that runs through all these visions speaks to the deepest longings of human hearts for healing, wholeness, and permanent peace. The New Jerusalem that John saw coming down from heaven represents not merely a future destination, but the ultimate goal toward which all divine activity in history is directed. Every dream, every vision, every divine intervention in human affairs contributes to the preparation for that final restoration when God will dwell with humanity in perfect fellowship and every tear will be wiped away. The mystery of divine communication through dreams reminds us that there are dimensions of reality beyond what our ordinary senses can perceive, depths of meaning that cannot be grasped through purely rational analysis. The God who created both the material and spiritual dimensions of existence continues to use both in his ongoing communication with creation. Dreams and visions serve as windows into spiritual reality, moments when the veil between heaven and earth becomes thin and eternal truth breaks through into temporal consciousness. The reverence with which these sacred encounters are recorded in Scripture teaches us to approach our own spiritual experiences with humility and careful discernment. Not every dream carries divine significance, but the possibility remains that God may choose to communicate through the mysterious realm of sleep and vision. The key is developing the spiritual sensitivity that can distinguish between ordinary psychological phenomena and authentic divine communication, the wisdom that recognizes the voice of the Good Shepherd among all the other voices that compete for our attention. The community aspect of many of these visions reminds us that divine communication is often intended not merely for individual benefit, but for the welfare of entire communities or nations. Joseph's dreams ultimately serve to preserve not only his own family, but the entire population of Egypt and surrounding regions during the years of famine. Daniel's visions provided comfort and hope for the Jewish people throughout centuries of foreign domination. John's revelation was addressed to 7 churches, but intended for the encouragement of believers throughout all subsequent history. This communal dimension of divine communication teaches us to hold our own spiritual experiences lightly, recognizing that they may be intended not merely for our personal benefit, but for the service of others who need the comfort, wisdom, or encouragement that comes through our encounter with divine reality. The gifts of the Spirit are given not for personal aggrandizement, but for the common good, and this principle applies to the gift of spiritual vision as much as to any other divine endowment. The poetic language often used to describe these visions reminds us that the deepest spiritual truths cannot always be expressed in purely logical or scientific terms. The symbolic imagery, the metaphorical descriptions, the apparent contradictions that sometimes appear in visionary accounts reflect the inadequacy of human language to contain divine reality rather than any confusion in the visions themselves. Poetry and symbol often convey truths that escape purely analytical approaches, touching the heart and imagination in ways that bypass the rational defenses that might otherwise reject spiritual truth. As we reflect on these ancient dreams and visions from the perspective of our own time and circumstances, we are reminded that the same divine love that reached out to comfort and guide our spiritual ancestors continues to be available to us today. The methods may be different, the imagery may reflect contemporary rather than ancient cultures, but the heart of divine communication remains unchanged. God still seeks to comfort the troubled, guide the confused, warn the rebellious, and encourage the faithful through whatever means are necessary to reach human hearts with divine love. The peace that comes from understanding our place in this great continuum of divine communication is deeper than any comfort that earthly circumstances can provide. We are not alone in our struggles, not abandoned to face life's challenges without divine assistance, not left to make sense of existence without heavenly guidance. The God who spoke to Abraham under the stars, who revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush, who comforted Elijah in the gentle whisper after the earthquake and fire, continues to communicate with those who have ears to hear and hearts to receive his love. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the activities of day give way to the mysteries of night, we join the eternal rhythm of divine human communion that has continued since the first dawn of creation. Our own dreams may not carry the earth-shaking significance of biblical visions, but they participate in the same divine desire to bridge the gap between heaven and earth, to touch finite minds with infinite love, to provide guidance and comfort through the mysterious channels that connect the material and spiritual dimensions of existence. The tapestry of divine dreams and visions reveals itself as an intricate masterpiece woven through the fabric of human history, each thread carefully placed to create a pattern of meaning that becomes more beautiful and complete with each passing age. The dreams that visited our spiritual ancestors were not isolated incidents, but part of a grand design that encompasses all of creation in its scope and extends from the first moment of divine creativity to the final consummation of all things in perfect harmony with divine will. When we examine the progression of these sacred encounters, we discover that they build upon one another like movements in a cosmic symphony, each one adding new harmonies and deeper understanding to the great theme of divine love pursuing human hearts. Adam's sleep introduced the principle of divine gift-giving through supernatural means, establishing the pattern of God providing for human needs in ways that exceed expectation and demonstrate the abundance of divine love. This first dream set the stage for all subsequent divine communication through the realm of sleep and vision. Jacob's ladder expanded this understanding to include the concept of ongoing divine activity on behalf of human welfare, showing that heaven and earth are connected by invisible channels through which blessings flow continuously to meet earthly needs. The angels ascending and descending revealed that what appears to be natural providence is actually the result of purposeful spiritual activity directed by divine wisdom and motivated by divine love. Joseph's dreams introduced the element of prophetic revelation, showing that divine communication can extend across time to reveal future events and provide guidance for present decisions. His experience demonstrated that the gift of understanding divine communication brings with it both privilege and responsibility, the joy of knowing divine purposes, and the burden of speaking truth that others may not be ready to receive. The dreams of foreign rulers like Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar expanded the understanding of divine communication to include those outside the covenant community, revealing that God's concern extends to all humanity, and that divine wisdom is available to any heart humble enough to seek and receive it. These visions showed that political power and earthly authority do not exempt anyone from the need for divine guidance, and that the highest human wisdom is inadequate to address the deepest questions of existence and destiny. The visions granted to the prophets introduced the element of divine commissioning, showing that encounters with heavenly reality always involve transformation and calling to service. Isaiah's temple vision, Ezekiel's riverside encounter, and Daniel's apocalyptic dreams all resulted in prophetic ministries that would comfort and guide the people of God through centuries of trial and tribulation. These visions demonstrated that divine communication is never merely for personal edification, but always includes an element of service to others who need the comfort and guidance that come through authentic spiritual encounter. John's revelation on Patmos brought this progression to its climax, showing the ultimate fulfillment of all divine purposes in the establishment of a new heaven and new earth, where God dwells with humanity in perfect fellowship forever. His vision tied together all the threads that had been introduced in earlier dreams and visions, showing their ultimate meaning and final resolution in the triumph of divine love over all the forces that oppose it. The geographical settings of these visions also reveal a pattern of divine purpose that extends across all the earth and transcends cultural and national boundaries. From the Garden of Eden, where Adam first slept in divine peace, to the wilderness where Jacob encountered the ladder of angels, to the palaces of Egypt and Babylon, where foreign rulers received divine communication, to the temple in Jerusalem, where Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up, to the rivers of exile, where Ezekiel beheld the divine chariot throne, to the island of Patmos, where John received the final revelation. Every location became sacred ground when touched by divine presence. This geographical diversity teaches us that no place is too remote for divine visitation, no circumstance too difficult for divine intervention, no situation too desperate for divine hope. The God who reveals himself through dreams and visions is not confined to particular locations or limited by earthly boundaries, but can manifest his presence wherever human hearts are prepared to receive divine communication. The timing of these visions also reveals divine wisdom in its perfect coordination with human need and historical necessity. Each dream came at precisely the moment when it would have maximum impact and provide the greatest benefit to those who received it and those who would hear about it in subsequent generations. This perfect timing demonstrates that divine providence is actively involved in the smallest details of human existence, orchestrating events and circumstances to accomplish purposes that often remain hidden until their fulfillment reveals the wisdom that guided their planning. The variety of recipients chosen for these divine communications shows that God's selection is based not on human worthiness or achievement, but on divine grace and purpose. Adam received his vision as an innocent who had not yet experienced the corruption of sin. Jacob encountered divine presence as a fugitive fleeing the consequences of his own deception. Joseph received his dreams as a youth whose character had not yet been tested by serious trial. Daniel and his friends were faithful servants of God living in exile among pagans. Isaiah was a priest serving in the temple when his vision came. Ezekiel was a priest in exile far from the temple he had expected to serve. John was an aged apostle suffering persecution for his faith. This diversity of circumstances and character demonstrates that divine communication is available to human beings in every possible situation and condition. There is no prerequisite of perfect righteousness, no requirement of ideal circumstances, no demand for advanced spiritual achievement before God will speak to human hearts through dreams and visions. Divine communication flows from divine love, not human merit, and is given according to divine purpose, not human deserving. The content of these dreams and visions also reveals the breadth and depth of divine concern for human welfare. Some visions addressed immediate practical needs, like Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams that led to preparation for famine. Others revealed long-term historical patterns, like Daniel's visions of future kingdoms that would provide hope and understanding for centuries of subsequent history. Still others opened windows into eternal realities, like Isaiah's temple vision that revealed the ongoing worship that surrounds the throne of God, regardless of earthly circumstances. This variety of content shows that divine communication encompasses every aspect of human existence, from the most mundane practical concerns to the loftiest spiritual realities. God is interested not only in the ultimate destiny of the human soul, but also in the daily needs that press upon human consciousness. Divine love extends to every dimension of human experience, providing guidance for earthly decisions while also revealing eternal truths that give meaning and purpose to temporary existence. The symbolic language used in these visions speaks to the limitation of human understanding when confronted with divine reality. The strange creatures, the complex imagery, the apparent contradictions that sometimes appear in visionary accounts reflect not confusion in the divine communication, but the inadequacy of human language and concepts to contain infinite truth. Just as a small vessel cannot contain the ocean, so finite human consciousness cannot fully grasp the infinite dimensions of divine reality revealed in authentic spiritual vision. Yet the symbolic language also serves the positive purpose of making divine truth accessible to human understanding across cultural and temporal boundaries. The same symbols speak to hearts in every age and every culture because they touch archetypal truths embedded in the very structure of created reality. Light speaks of divine revelation, darkness of ignorance and sin, water of cleansing and life, fire of purification and judgment, mountains of stability and divine presence, valleys of humility and preparation. These universal symbols enable divine communication to transcend the limitations of particular languages and cultures, speaking directly to human consciousness at levels deeper than rational analysis. They engage not only the intellect but also the imagination and emotions, creating understanding that encompasses the whole person rather than merely the thinking mind. The preservation of these visionary accounts in sacred scripture demonstrates their ongoing significance for every generation of believers. They were recorded not merely as historical curiosities, but as sources of comfort, guidance, and hope for all who would face similar challenges in subsequent ages. Each dream and vision continues to speak across the centuries, offering its unique contribution to human understanding of divine nature and purpose. The careful preservation of even the smallest details in these accounts shows the reverence with which the original recipients and subsequent communities regarded these divine communications. Nothing was considered too minor to record, no symbol too strange to preserve, no detail too obscure to remember. This meticulous care in preservation reflects the understanding that divine communication carries eternal significance that may not be fully apparent until future generations discover meanings and applications that were hidden from the original recipients. The influence of these biblical dreams and visions on subsequent human culture and spirituality has been immeasurable. They have inspired countless works of art, literature, and music. They have provided comfort to millions who faced persecution, exile, and suffering. They have offered hope to those who struggled with doubt and despair. They have guided decisions that shape the course of history and influence the development of civilizations. This ongoing influence demonstrates that authentic divine communication carries within it a vitality and relevance that transcend the circumstances of its original reception. Like seeds planted in fertile soil, these visions continue to grow and bear fruit in every generation, providing nourishment for hungry souls and light for those who walk in darkness. The study of these dreams and visions also reveals patterns and principles that can guide our understanding of how divine communication operates in our own time. While we may not receive visions of the same magnitude as those granted to the biblical prophets and patriarchs, the same God who spoke to them continues to communicate with those who have ears to hear and hearts to receive divine guidance. The conditions that seem to favor divine communication through dreams and visions include spiritual hunger and seeking, humility and openness to divine instruction, willingness to act upon divine guidance regardless of personal cost, and genuine concern for the welfare of others rather than merely personal advantage. These attitudes create the receptivity that enables human consciousness to receive communications that might otherwise be missed or misunderstood. The discernment required to distinguish authentic divine communication from psychological phenomena or spiritual deception is developed through careful study of scriptural examples, prayer for wisdom and understanding, consultation with mature spiritual counselors, and patient waiting for confirmation through circumstances and inner peace. Authentic divine communication always produces fruit that is consistent with divine character love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The responsibility that comes with receiving divine communication, whether through dreams, visions, or other means, includes careful stewardship of the revelation received, humble sharing with others who might benefit from the insight given, faithful obedience to any instructions received, and patient waiting for divine timing in the fulfillment of promises that may require years or even decades to be realized. The comfort that these ancient dreams and visions provide for contemporary believers extends far beyond their historical interest to touch the deepest needs of human hearts in every age. When we face our own dark nights of the soul, when circumstances seem to contradict divine promises, when the future appears uncertain and the present overwhelming, these sacred narratives remind us that divine purposes are often accomplished through means that seem contradictory to human wisdom. The patience exhibited by the recipients of these visions in waiting for their fulfillment teaches us that divine timing operates according to wisdom that surpasses human understanding. Joseph waited decades for the fulfillment of his youthful dreams. Daniel's visions extended across centuries before finding their complete realization. John's revelation of the New Jerusalem still awaits its final fulfillment in the age to come. Yet none of these delays diminish the certainty of ultimate fulfillment or the comfort that the visions provided during the waiting periods. The transformation that authentic divine encounter produces in human character is consistently demonstrated throughout these accounts. Each recipient of divine communication was changed by the experience, emerging with greater wisdom, deeper compassion, stronger faith, and clearer understanding of divine purposes. This transformation was not merely emotional or psychological, but involved fundamental changes in perspective, priority, and purpose that lasted throughout their lives and influenced countless others who came into contact with them. The universal scope of divine concern, revealed in these visions, challenges any narrow understanding of God's love and purposes. The same divine care that was shown to the chosen people of Israel was also extended to Egyptian pharaohs and Babylonian kings when their decisions would affect the welfare of multitudes. This demonstrates that divine love transcends religious, cultural, and national boundaries, seeking the welfare of all humanity and working through whatever channels are available to accomplish purposes of blessing and salvation. The integration of practical wisdom with spiritual insight that characterizes many of these visions shows that authentic divine communication always has practical application for earthly life. Joseph's interpretation of dreams led to practical programs for famine relief. Daniel's understanding of divine sovereignty provided guidance for faithful living under foreign rule. Isaiah's temple vision resulted in prophetic ministry that addressed social justice as well as spiritual renewal. This practical dimension of divine communication reminds us that authentic spiritual experience enhances rather than diminishes our ability to deal effectively with earthly responsibilities. True spirituality never withdraws from the world, but equips us to engage with worldly concerns from the perspective of heavenly wisdom and with the power that comes from divine resources. The hope that permeates all these visions, even those that speak of judgment and trial, reflects the fundamental optimism of divine love that refuses to be defeated by human rebellion or natural disaster. Every vision ultimately points toward restoration, renewal, and the establishment of divine purposes that will bring blessing to all creation. Even the most severe judgments described in prophetic vision are revealed to be disciplinary rather than vindictive, intended to restore rather than destroy, motivated by love rather than anger. This underlying note of hope provides the foundation for faith that can endure any trial and peace that can survive any storm. The God who revealed himself in dreams and visions to our spiritual ancestors has not changed in character or purpose. His love remains constant, his faithfulness endures forever, and his purposes will surely be accomplished despite all apparent obstacles and delays. As we allow these sacred stories to settle into our consciousness like seeds finding fertile soil, we join the great community of believers who have found comfort and guidance in these ancient revelations. We become part of the continuing story of divine human communication that began in Eden and will continue until all things are made new in the final restoration of creation to its intended purpose. The peace that comes from understanding our place in this great continuum of divine communication is deeper than any comfort that earthly circumstances can provide. We are not alone in our struggles, not abandoned to face life's challenges without divine assistance, not left to make sense of existence without heavenly guidance. The same divine love that reached out to comfort and guide our spiritual ancestors continues to be available to us today, seeking to communicate through whatever means are necessary to reach our hearts with divine truth and love. So rest now in the peace that comes from knowing that you are part of a story larger than any earthly narrative, participants in a divine drama that stretches from the first dawn of creation to the eternal noon of the age to come. Let the memories of these sacred dreams and visions wash over your consciousness like gentle waves, carrying away the anxieties of the day and replacing them with the deep certainty that comes from understanding your place in the eternal purposes of heaven. The God who speaks in dreams is watching over your sleep, and his purposes for your life are good, and his plans for your future are filled with hope beyond your highest imagination.